Welcome, students. Today, in this week, we will discuss institutions and economic growth. So again, I'm following a similar pattern to other weeks in this video, in that I just go through a main introduction and then the articles that are either prescribed for you to read or summarize and present. Remember, it is always best to read all the articles so that you can get a holistic view of the topic. So what are institutions? So Douglas North defines institutions as the rules of the game. So these can be anything from culture to laws and regulations to accepted norms and behaviors. So, because of this and how widely institutions are described, they can shape both political, social, and economic exchanges. So, last week we had the study by Nunn and Wanchikon that I'll come back later to as well on mistrust. So, how can you exchange if there is high levels of mistrust in a society? And he says that because of this institutional interaction between individuals and their behavior and society, it is important to know how history changed and shaped this. So Williamson, in his 2000 paper, provides a framework on the various institutions that we get. So from informal institutions, which would be cultures and norms, to formal institutions, which are laws and regulations, to governance. So how do you implement these informal and formal institutions? And this ultimately leads to your resource allocation. And he describes how long it takes for each of these to adjust, with informal institutions taking the longest, and informal institutions can take up to a millennia to change, while resource allocation can happen relatively quickly or even immediately. So, the fathers of new institutional economics that you can also look at if you are curious further about this topic is Ronald Coase, Douglas North, and Oliver Williamson. Um, and then the reason why I do this session in this course is because institutions and economic history go hand in hand. Like I mentioned before, with North's definition, it's shaped by historical change, and therefore we need the historical aspect to understand our current institutions and how institutions change. So the first article is by Douglas North. He was the Nobel recipient for economics in 1993 on his work on institutions and new institutional economics. So this is published in a high-ranking journal, the Journal of Economic Literature. You can see the impact factor is very high at 6.614. So the Journal of Economic Literature often looks at studies or literature reviews on a specific subject, and this is one such case where he basically reviews all the articles on institutional literature. Sokoloff and Engermann, their 2000 paper, it's one of my favorite papers, and I often cite it both in my own work and my master's students use it a lot. So Kenneth Sokoloff, was at UCLA, and Stanley Engermann is at the University of Rochester. So this is again a relatively high impact factor journal, the Journal of Economic Perspectives, 5.012. So this also relates to education and how colonies in the New World, specifically Canada and the US, formed policies around education that ultimately enabled their economic growth. But they also try to relate the economic history lessons and lessons that we can learn from institutional economics to what we can do and learn today. Clark, 1996. So we've met Clark before in the session on the Industrial Revolution. So again, if you read all the articles, you see the broader picture. You see how institutions in the Industrial Revolution start working together and how they are interconnected. So in this paper, he really relates the political institutions in England to the growth that happened from the 16th century to the later periods. I think I forgot to write down the exact date. But really, again, how political institutions like Parliament and the rules around that can influence economic growth. This is in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History, a lower ranking journal, and it's also a history journal more than specifically an or economics or economic history journal. Ronald Coase, like I mentioned, is one of the fathers of new institutional economics. He used to be at the University of Chicago Law School. So again, if you look at these, you look where these people come from, you look at where they publish, it's a relationship between law and economics. It's a relationship between institutions and laws and economic outcomes, and how these laws interact with the institutions that we find elsewhere. So this is the Journal of Law and Economics. It's also a very nice journal to read. 0.29 impact factor, so a relatively low impact factor, but still a good journal overall. So he really asks, how do you measure actions that have a social cost that under new classical economics would be assumed to be bad and therefore should be avoided? He also has a paper where he discusses this idea of how do we measure and disincentivize actions that have a social cost. And when I was reading through this article again, I was thinking about problems that we face today, the COVID pandemic and vaccine hesitancy or climate change. How do we measure some of these impacts under institutions? So Gary Cox is at Stanford University. He studies in this article how growth of cities relates to the Great Divergence. So we've mentioned the Great Divergence before, this idea that the Industrial Revolution led to the income inequality that we face today. So he mentions that there are various institutional arrangements involved in this growth of cities, and for example, technology is based more in cities. So how does that relate to institutions? Also, parliaments are based in cities. How does that relate to the rules and laws, ultimately impacting institutions? So it's published in the Journal of Economic History, and we have seen this before quite a number of times. Loaves et al. So there are a bunch of authors on, I think 4 or 5 authors on this paper. They're all based at Harvard except for Robinson, who's at the University of Chicago. Robinson's famous paper we'll encounter next week under property rights. This is also in Econometrica, like Dell's paper from colonialism. So again, it's very econometrically advanced and focuses a lot on the data and the methodology of measurement. So they try to measure the interactions between culture and institutions, and specifically state centralization and social norms. And they use the Cuba, I think it's Cuba kingdom in Africa. Finally, we have James Fensker. He's at Warwick University. The Economic Journal we've also seen in the Industrial Revolution Week. So if you're curious about the status and impact factor, you can have a look at those slides. So he studies the hypothesis of land abundance impact on institutions. And by doing this, he really adds geography to the aspect. The interrelationship between geography and institutions as well, and how this matters. So again, when I was reading this study, I really am reminded of 9 and Wanchicon and how they have mistrust that they measure. Mistrust or trust can be seen as an informal institution, and how geography shaped that mistrust. And he does a similar aspect in the study where he studies the land abundance in Africa and how that impacted certain institutions in various African countries. Pardon. So I hope you enjoy institutions. I really like the aspect of institutions and how they interact with social and economic outcomes.